This is TreppWire Week in Review for week ending July 10th. I'm Martha Kocher with Trepp, a data modeling and analytics firm for the CMBS, commercial real estate, and CLO markets. Each week, I'm joined with our experts, Manus Clancy, Senior Managing Director, and Joe McBride, Head of CRE Finance. This week, signs that the economy is slowly moving in the right direction. Initial jobless claims came in better than expected at 1.3 million, even as several states reversed course and announced closures to restaurants, bars, and casinos because of a surge in COVID cases. Quarterly earnings season is getting underway with adjusted expectations, and a number of permanent job losses are showing up in the hardest hit industries. Yet it seems Wall Street is craving any news that the economy is on the right course. Manus, you went optimistic on us last week. Are you still feeling the same?
I'm still feeling optimistic. Last week we talked about at this point in the COVID cycle, if you think that we're a year away from a vaccine, we're now, a third of the way home, which is great. You hear about all this terrific research going on and so many different firms trying to ramp up either vaccines or cures or treatments for people that have it. So I'm optimistic there. We've seen a lot more openings in the Northeast. Now we saw malls open in New York, at least those ones that have the proper ventilation are now opening at this point. Disney's going to still open this week down south. So I think there are some green shoots there. And, last week we scratched beneath the surface on the numbers a little bit. But the one thing I keep coming back to is, back in April, we had about 3,000 deaths a day when we only really had one supercell. And that one supercell was in the Northeast, in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut corridor. And now we have about 40 cells, yet the number of deaths we're seeing on a daily basis is, a sixth to a third of what we were seeing at the peak when we only had one cell. So I remain cautiously optimistic on that front. And I'm also optimistic with the numbers we're seeing economically, that they all seem to just be coming out a little bit better than anticipated. The jobs number last week came out after we recorded our podcast last week, and that just blew people away just by the sheer number of jobs that were added, a record-breaking number. So I'm still not a V-shaped guy, and the stock market seems frothy, but I do feel, hopeful.
Well, let me give you a little slice of life here. I was away from Sunday to Wednesday down in Jersey at the beach. And I've now learned a lesson that, Martha and Manus, you've learned a long time ago, which is that vacations with kids are not really vacations. They're more like heavy duty manual labor. So I'm very happy to be back in my cushy home office, seeing your mugs, recording the podcast. I will say, it's a different world. We were down in Jersey at the beach and, people were generally happy and friendly and maybe you were standing 1 foot farther away from each other than you normally would. But people wore masks in stores, but otherwise, there were hotels and motel parking lots that had cars in them, right? And there were tons of tractor trailers on the road to and from. And, I just felt like, okay, it's the summer and people are going to the beach, and there was some sense of normalcy there, which is definitely a nice feeling. Although my back is killing me from carrying all those chairs and umbrellas and sunscreen and toys and everything else.
Well, we did see, some other returns to normalcy. We saw, well, I'm not sure if it's normal, but we did see baseball players start to throw a ball around at Citi Field and other major league parks this week with a plan to start reopening day, if you will, later in July, which is exciting. I'm looking forward to that. Major League Soccer started last night. They still can't use their hands, which is great in this COVID world. So, we got some regular sports coming back, and like I said, things to look forward to.
It seems we had a mix of good and bad news on the macro level airlines with layoffs, a pretty cautious tone from the Delta CEO, and some other things. But there were some green shoots.
So we've seen a couple of anecdotal positive data points. I think we put in TreppWire last week that hotel occupancy is up to 45%. I think the bottom was 20% in April. I think break-even levels of kind of lodging occupancies obviously differ at every different hotel, but I think 55% or so is when you're probably covering your debt service payments. And I think, upwards of 70% or 75% is probably the number we want to be to get back to relative normal. I think there was a couple of things out. St. Louis Fed, James Bullard, he came out and said unemployment could be back to 7 or 8% by the end of the year, which at the rate that we saw it improve this past month, that's definitely possible. Now, if we see the W or the square root, as Rick Jones mentioned, then we may not get back there that fast. But, we're seeing green shoots, right? And we're seeing things getting slightly better here and there. And I have to continue to believe that growth will occur and that people will go back to work. Something that I'm a little worried about on both sides of the coin is the extension or non-extension of the unemployment benefits at the federal level, the extra $600 a week. I think, in an election year, it's likely that the Republicans and Trump want to extend it because they don't want, people getting even more restless than they already are. But on the same token, you want to incentivize people to go back to work who can, right? So maybe a phased approach where they lower it by $100 a month or something like that over the next few months might be what happens. But I think, multifamily is something to think about if that does just come completely off the table at the end of July, if they don't extend it, right? Because multifamily has been doing very well, even though people are losing their jobs. And I think a lot of that is due to the fact that a lot of people are making more on unemployment than they were before. So I know I went a bunch of different ways there, but those are just some of my thoughts on that.
So looking at TreppWire headlines that we covered this week, let's do a roundup of what some of those were for our listeners, Manus.
Well, I came up with a new thought this week, which we didn't put in TreppWire, but we should have, establishing a ring of honor like they have at football stadiums. It would be for borrowers in distressed segments of CRE that manage to keep their loans current in April, May, June, and July. We did highlight some of these positive stories during the week in our daily research, but I wanted to go through some of these names one by one to give people the credit they're due. The owners of the mall at Rockingham Park in Salem, New Hampshire, they have a $162 million loan, have made their last 4 payments, including the one in July. Same for the owners of the North Star Mall in San Antonio, $286 million CMBS loan. The owners of the Altamonte Mall in Altamonte Springs, Florida, or Altamont, I'm not sure, $153 million loan. The owners of the Fashion Show Mall in Las Vegas, a nearly $1 billion loan, current in April, May, June, and July. And also the owners of the Hyatt Regency, Waikiki Beach, a $400 million loan. Now that's just some of those borrowers that have stayed current during this period. There are others. We can't name them all due to time constraints, but it's part of the glass half full narrative that I've been trying to keep going for the last couple weeks. And in this time period, with COVID-19, the temptation to maintain liquidity and squirreling cash away must be really enormous for these borrowers right now. So for these owners to keep the loans current, that's it's like the scene from It's a Wonderful Life, when there's that run on the bank and everybody's asking George Bailey for $20 and Mrs. Davis comes in and only asks for $17.50.
And he kisses her.
There's something really special about that scene. And there's really something quite feel good about borrowers in places where maybe you have been completely shut down, or maybe you're running at 10 or 20% occupancy and you're still paying your nut every month. And I think that's terrific. And like I said, there's more guys than just this, but I just wanted to rattle off a few that have managed to pull it off.
It's kind of like the perfect attendance record, except I don't know, that maybe it's a little bit better than that, because you kind of always like scoffed at the perfect attendance guy. You know, like really, man, really?
Yeah.
I mean, there's not a ring of dishonor, right? If you needed help during this period and you own a hotel or a retail property and you're looking for a forbearance, there's no shame in that, but there's a certain amount of dignity in somehow managing to squeeze this out. If you have a 10% or 20% occupancy rate on a hotel, especially in Hawaii, I mean, how many people can they be getting on a nightly basis, and what could their RevPAR be? And the same is true for these mall owners. You know, kudos to you guys.
So there was some negative news, though, and a little bit of it on the retail side as well as on the hotel side. So let's talk about a few of those.
Should we start with your alma mater not playing football this fall?
Well, no Ivy League football, that's true. Some people would call that a good story, right? When you see the level of play out there, it's
especially for your alma mater, definitely.
It's a mixed bag out there, I have to say. I'm not sure the 1,600 people that attend the games will ever get over the fact that we'll not see fall football in Inwood or Cambridge or Philadelphia this fall. But where are we going to find the next Ryan Fitzpatrick, the journeyman quarterback known for his Fitzmagic comebacks with the Jets and the Dolphins and others? He's a Harvard guy, and every now and then they squeeze one out that makes it to the NFL and makes a name for themselves.
Ryan Fitzpatrick, the best beard in the NFL, often compared with our producer Keegan St. Angeme's beard.
The other CMBS stories to talk about, some good and some bad, as Martha said. On the good side, we saw a $100 million refinance of 52 Broadway, a 400,000 square foot property, single tenant in Lower Manhattan. That means an $80 million 2010 conduit loan will be paid off very shortly, either this month or next month. That loan makes up 15% of GSMS 2010 C2. So good news for those bond owners there. Normally this would have been a big yawn of a story 6 months ago, but you can't really take anything for granted right now. And these guys getting refinancing is terrific. We saw a $568 million single borrower loan backed by 4 malls, 2 in Texas, 1 in Arizona, 1 in Utah. They were granted a 1-year extension to their maturity, which was to happen in June. Now their maturity has been pushed out to June 2021 in a deal between the borrower and the special servicer.
And that was an actual modification, right? It wasn't an extension option.
It was a modification, true modification. Right. And then lastly, for those who have been waiting patiently for the distressed hotel pipeline to open up, your ship may be coming in. It's hard to know. We have a $204 million single borrower loan that we'll be writing about in TreppWire on Friday morning. It's 90 days delinquent as of July. First time special servicer comments this month indicated that the borrower wants to transition the properties to the mezz lender. There's a $25 million mezz loan on this. The loan is backed by 22 hotels in the Southeast, mostly in the Southeast of the US. If the mezz loan holder doesn't cure the loan, then these things would start going through the foreclosure process. So this would be the first indication that things are starting to come through the pipeline. Of course, the mezz loan holder could cure this, but we're now 90 days delinquent, and that may be a tell as to their appetite to take on this liability. So we'll see. So if you don't get TreppWire, you should. And this story will be written on Friday morning to cover that particular angle.
In CMBS, the push for relief may be reaching a peak as Trepp has been hit on all sides for data on delinquency trends, especially in hospitality and retail. 2 of our listeners, professors at Cornell and MIT, have shared with us their proposal for addressing distressed mortgages. They propose that the federal government defease the most distressed mortgages. How would that work?
Well, it's a very creative idea. Daniel Kwan, who's the Robert C. Baker Professor of Real Estate at Cornell, and Walter Torres, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, of the Sloan School of Management at MIT. Their idea, which is, as I said, very creative, would allow Treasury to defease certain CMBS loans out of CMBS trusts as a way to give borrowers an opportunity to cure their loans without the stresses coming from the special servicers or the limitations that come from being under a REMIC structure or the rules that a special servicer must maintain. So this is very interesting. For those that don't know what a defeasance is, it happens when a borrower wants to remove himself from the debt on his loan. He does so by taking his collateral away from the CMBS trust and replacing it with US Treasuries that replicate the cash flow that the loan would have given. So in some ways, this is the absolute nirvana for bondholders. First of all, they get cash flow certainty. A loan can no longer default. And they also get a higher credit quality instead of something that might be a triple B level credit rating in terms of a hotel or a mall or whatever the credit is perceived to be. You're now getting AAA US Treasuries to replace it. So it's a great thing when it happens naturally. What these two professors are talking about is using it as a vehicle where the Treasuries would replace the debt in the CMBS trust, so cash flow would be preserved. The liability would go to the Treasury, and it would be up to Treasury to negotiate with the borrowers, things like forbearances, and they could do things like allow them to tap reserves, perhaps easier than they could do with the special servicer or the master servicer, or have other types of accommodations. The one tweak that was a little bit hard to get our arms around was the fact that they think that once a loan cures, it would go back into a CMBS trust. That's a little tricky to kind of pull off. It would make pricing of this risk very hard for bond holders if you thought that you had Treasuries today, but someday down the road you could be replaced again with a hotel credit. That may be a bridge too far, but it's certainly something that merits further debate, and it was an interesting piece. If you're interested in getting the piece, ping us at info@trepp.com, and we will try to get the rights from these two professors to share it with you.
Ping us at podcast@trepp.com. Manus is still using the info, which was created in about 1979. But you can ping us there, and we will see it, and we'll help you out. I think it's interesting. It was definitely a new concept, right, when it came into our inboxes, and I read it, and definitely well thought out and well reasoned. A couple of questions come up. One is, what about the short sellers, right? What about the guys who are short CMBX? I mean, is this fair to these investors who have made very well formulated, well researched, put a lot of effort and work into taking a position against or short a specific index or bond or whatever it may be, and now the powers that be come swooping in to save the day. It's amazing for the long guys, the guys who hold the bonds. Not so great for the short guys. I don't know if anybody necessarily outside of this universe cares about short sellers and what the public perception might be. But last week I said, why not us, right? And I think Lisa Pendergast, who's the head of CREFC, is out there saying, all of these bailout programs, PPP and unemployment and TALF and everything else, they've all passed over the commercial real estate borrower, right? And, why not us kind of thing. I believe that with one part of my heart, and the other part of my heart thinks like, free market is better and we should let things, but then again, it's a government I know I'm going back and forth. I'm like Jekyll and Hyde here. It's a government mandated shutdown, right? So I was I was running my business great. I owned a hotel. It was, great occupancy, managing the property well, paying my employees, so on and so on and so on. Then the government told me to close it, right? And now I might lose my property. So I can see that side of it, which is the government should actually help out, right? So it's kind of like two sides of my brain that are fighting against each other in this debate.
On that particular topic, we do have a forthcoming podcast with Rick Jones, who covers some of the technical aspects of what a bailout would look like. And he also handicaps whether he thinks one will happen or not. And it's a really interesting listen. We're going to come out with that next week. So we'll tease that a little bit. But going back to the proposal by Professors Kwan and Toros, it would create winners and losers, like you said. Among the winners would be first loss guys that hold sub-investment grade bonds, right? All of a sudden their credits would look a lot better, especially if we're talking about a one-way trail where loans can get defeased but not undefeased. IO holders who are counting on large levels of defaults eating away at their cash flow, a lot of that would be off the table as well. But as you said, it would be a torpedo to the hull of short sellers right now, especially if this was not just hotels, but if it was hotels, malls, multifamily, and other things, right? I think that that crying you would hear would be from Katie McGee and Dan McNamara.
Right. Well, it's so hard to come up with anything like this because there is a line that you draw between those that deserve or those that will get the bailout and those that won't. And imagine being the owner who is the last person who doesn't get the bailout. Right? Like, where do you draw that line? I mean, they talk about how, and this is not just this particular group, but any group who's talking about some sort of bailout is, it has to be a property or a loan that was performing before COVID hit and that is negatively affected by COVID, but, define performing, right? Is it 1.2 DSCR? Is it 1.25? Is it 1.3? And like, how do you make that definition? How do you support it? And how do you prevent excessive lobbying, right, from everybody from all different angles trying to kind of move the goalposts. So although I'm not really sure if I can I was asked on a call actually this morning if I could handicap the odds of something like this actually happening. I think it's slightly less than 50%, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. I think the preferred equity idea that's been floating around from MBA and CREFC seems more doable to me because there is an element of them asking to be paid back and they're going behind the mezz guys and things like that. So just for some reason it seems cleaner to do it that way. You still have to operate the property, right? You have to get the property through this time and be able to kind of recover. I think they were offering a year's worth of operating expenses and debt service payments in preferred equity, and they'll have to pay that back. So it just seems a little bit less bailouty than just saying we'll defease the loans and figure it out.
Bailouty. Okay.
Yep. That's a new word.
That is a new word.
Did you know that they added irregardless to Webster's dictionary, by the way?
It's wrong.
I am very, very upset about that. I just want to let you all know.
People just can't stop using it. So as Manus mentioned, we took a deep dive in the legal and regulatory impact of COVID, and we sat down with Deckert's Rick Jones, who runs the finance and real estate practice there. He had some interesting insights on things like the election and a potential bailout. What did you think, Manus, when we spoke with him?
He really didn't hold back when it came to topics like the forthcoming election, the likelihood of a bailout, like you said, what a bailout would look like, who the winners and losers coming out of this crisis would be. So I was really, really, I thought it was one of our best podcasts in terms of really having somebody open up with terrific opinions.
Yeah, I was very sad to miss that one being on vacation because I often trade phone calls with Rick about all sorts of weird stuff going on in the CRE world, especially CECL over the last few years. But just, the last time I spoke with Rick Jones, I was on the train on the Metro North on the way home from my last day in the office before the quarantine. I had my keyboard and my little adapter and my mouse in my bag, and I never knew if I was ever going back to the office. So I will always remember Rick as the guy I was talking to during that great divide moment.
He was impressed with your pocket protector, I remember.
Yes.
Well, he's always a great panel guest, right? He's always on the CREFC round table and other things, and he doesn't really hold back. So I'm looking forward to listening to it. I hope you guys are too.
Yeah, we'll release it next week, and definitely give that a listen if you're interested in what he has to say on the election and some other interesting topics. We are officially past the half-year mark. We put out a mid-year report in collaboration with our sister company, CRE Direct. This mid-year really highlights the magnitude of the pandemic's effects across the hardest hit sectors. And while it's not easy to encapsulate this 33-page report, let's talk about what some of the highlights were from it.
Well, we really go into deep dives on every property type. So much ink has been utilized on hotel and retail, and more every single day, right? We saw, Bed Bath & Beyond this week, and Brooks Brothers, Ascena, like you said, Martha, before, H&M negotiating rent reduction. So that's a story that just continues to roll out. But we use the magazine to dig into things like offices, multifamily, industrial, and so forth, which tell a much better story than the ones we've seen for hotel and retail over the last 6 months. So it was a nice change of pace to really focus on the positive in there. For those that don't know, we do produce this magazine twice a year. Normally it comes out in conjunction with the semi-annual CREFC conferences that are held in Miami and New York every 6 months. And even though we weren't going to do a conference this year, we thought it was useful to put out a magazine for both historical records, just to look back on this 5 and 10 years hence and kind of recall what we were looking at that period of time. We've been doing this for a long time now, but also just to share with our readers our insights about what the last 6 months have looked like and what the next 6 months might look like.
Yeah, I remember the first one we ever did, Martha, back in 2014. It was called Trepp or TreppWire Analysis and Perspectives.
Oh, yes.
Right. And since then, it's like everything we do at Trepp. It's like once you start doing it, you got to keep doing it.
Can't stop.
Right.
The conveyor belt never goes off.
That's right.
Exactly. Can't stop. But it is our most widely read piece that we put out, according to our producer, who also is our marketing analytics whiz. So it is something that I think people value because it does provide comprehensive information instead of just the daily snapshots that people normally get.
And I do think that we're part of the Publishers Clearinghouse circle of publications. So if you read the magazine, you still have the ability to win $7,000 a week for life in their drawing in August.
Well, wow, you threw me off there, Manus. I think one of the things that we do in this magazine, and we talk about this type of thing on a day-to-day basis or on a weekly basis on the podcast, but in the magazine, we do what we call the data digest, which basically looks back in time at all of these different numbers that we talk about: delinquencies, new issuance, special servicing rates, watch lists, and so on. And I think it's kind of like the, your Aunt Sally who always said like, oh my God, you've grown so much type of thing. It's one of those deals where you don't realize it from a day-to-day basis, but when you look back over time, it's kind of wild to see how crazy and how far we've come in some of these different metrics.
I'm going to take this kind of far afield after that comment about.
Oh, really? Surprising.
Shocking.
It just when you talk about, oh my, how you've grown. I was just reading this morning that Stanford announced that it was shutting down a third of their sports permanently. So no more rowing, no more fencing, a couple of other things they got rid of, I forget. but 11 out of 36 sports are being shut down for good. And it made me think of, what are people going to do now when they try to sneak their kids into college? I mean, you got to be really careful. Like, you can't put your kid into the, into the erg or the rowing jumpy and send it off to college and expect them to really believe you that you're a rowing recruit if they have no more team.
There is actually, I'll tell you a quick story. Again, there's a lot of weird people that live where I live. I was walking around the place where I live with my son, and I jumped because out of the corner of my eye, a man fully dressed in fencing gear was practicing by himself, going back and forth, with the whole en garde and all that stuff. So I realize where that guy lives, and I never go near I don't ever want to mess with that guy.
Okay, let's bring it around. Let's look at some banking data. To gauge the impact of the COVID-19 disruption, Trepp applied an economic and real estate forecast scenario to a portfolio of 13,000 commercial real estate loans from our bank loan data known as Taller. What were some of the findings, Joe?
Sure. So thanks, first of all, to Matt Anderson, who's kind of one of our chief model architects and chief economist at Trepp for doing a lot of the work for this report. He had put something similar together back in March. And I think Manus mentioned, what the heck this thing even is, the Taller, right? It's Trepp anonymized loan level repository. We've got about 20 banks contributing quarterly loan level data. And what we do is we put it all together, we anonymize it, we clean it up, and we then redistribute the data back to the providers or the contributors. And as part of that, we can do a lot of our own analysis on it as well. And in this case, what we did both in March and, just this week, I think today we released the report today, meaning Thursday, is we took those loans and we ran them through our commercial real estate default model, our probability of default loss given default model. And, the model itself has been around for a few years. So the real important aspect of this is trying to figure out what the heck macroeconomic scenario we should use and what adjustments we should make for different property types. So in this case, just some high level outputs of this. It's a 5-year forward-looking forecast view on these loans. I think the loans kind of had an average LTV around 40 or 45%. Now those values are pre-COVID values. So the true LTVs are likely significantly higher. But anyway, we're using the reported values. Cumulative default rates for lodging around 21%, for retail about 9%, office, multifamily, and other were in the 4.5% to 6.5% cumulative default range, and industrial was the lowest, not surprisingly, at 2.4%. Some of our forward-looking scenarios did actually improve in this go round as compared to in March, right? In March, we didn't know. We thought unemployment rate was going to hit 20% or higher. GDP was going to be, negative 50 or whatever it may be. And we have a lot more clarity and just a lot more data on how things are performing. And so, but generally what we saw or what we used was, almost a 50% drop in values for lodging, peak to trough. 23% drop for what we would call freestanding retail. So the off-mall kind of either single building or kind of strip center type properties. Over 50% drop in values on regional malls. So again, it's a great report and it's got a lot of detail about all the different property types and vintages and geographies. We did some geographic work as well. But all of it is dependent upon the scenarios and the inputs, right? So, this is our best guess at this point, given the data that we have today, and we'll continue to update this analysis, as time goes on and more data comes out.
I should add that the model itself was back tested on a couple decades worth of data, really granular loan level data that, takes into consideration things like rising and falling values, occupancy, debt service coverage ratio, net cash flow, et cetera. So While Joe likes to set the bar low, which, under promise and over deliver, which is terrific. It is really based on a great deal of thought and really, really deep granular data.
Yeah, and the losses are actually, in March, they were higher in our COVID scenario, they were higher than what the severely adverse from the Fed would have indicated. But in this new update, they're actually slightly lower. So, which is interesting, right? Because we've been saying the severely adverse case that the Fed has promulgated to the universe in their stress testing mandates wasn't bad enough. And now we're thinking maybe it was. Unemployment rate did blow past the 10% mark, which is about where the severely adverse case peaks, but seems like we're coming back down to that level very quickly. So again, a deep, dense research piece that is worth picking up.
This week, we published a European update that showed that the markets in Europe are slowly coming back in CLOs and CMBS. Give us a quick snapshot of what that looks like.
The market's coming back slowly. The CMBS market in Europe always lags the US market for several reasons, one of which includes privacy issues prevent issuers and borrowers from disclosing a ton of things to investors. So it's not a market that has ever really exploded to the extent that the US market has. And its timing always seems to be one of those things like Lucy pulling the football away from Charlie Brown. You have a good year where you get a bunch of deals done and you're starting to see the market recover and people start to hire. And then you run into the great financial crisis, and then it starts to pick up again, and then you have Brexit, and then you start to pick up again, and now you have COVID. So I give credit to the guys that keep hammering away and keep trying to bring deals to market. And we have seen a couple deals done this year, which is nice. But like I said, it just seems to be a little bit star-crossed in terms of its timing. But I think there is potential down the road for that market to grow and be a more formidable source of capital than it's been in recent years.
Yeah, everything we see and everything we hear, we're constantly in communication with experts especially in the UK. And it always is, you always kind of forget, and it's always surprising that the market for commercial real estate itself, but also for information, for data, for software, and forms of capital seemingly is much more disparate and much less advanced than the US is in terms of standardized reporting and property management systems and all these other things. So we kind of take for granted in the US that it's relatively easy to pool a bunch of commercial real estate loans together and put an Annex A and a prospectus together and push it out to the market. Because we have access to all this data, but that's not really the case over there. And that is, I think, historically slowed things down a bit. And of course, the timing aspect as well that Manus mentioned reminded me of our digression on the American Dream Mall last week, right? Just every time you think you're going to, get off the starting block, something else comes out of the woodwork and hits you.
We'll be doing a European CLO and CMBS update later this week with a partner firm, EDW. So if that's an area of interest, check that out. It'll be at the end of this month. On Saturday, Disney World is reopening its Magic Kingdom and Animal Kingdom parks, while in contrast, theaters like AMC and Cineworld have decided to delay reopening until the end of July. Can we return to some normalcy this summer? What is it?
So a couple of related headlines that I saw. One was in Disney World, Japan, they outlawed screaming on roller coasters, just in case you happen to scream some spittle out into the universe, I guess. I don't know how you can enforce that, but I can just imagine how weird that must be to sit on a King de Ka going 150 miles an hour and not say something. I also saw that Walmart, I just saw this article like 2 seconds ago. Walmart is going to open a bunch of its parking lots to do drive-in movies, which I think is a great interesting use case for, drumming up some additional revenue and potentially, bringing some more foot traffic to the store itself. So I think that, people are coming up with innovative ways to survive this whole crisis from an economic point of view. And like I said before, we're getting there, right? It's going to take a long time. I think Marcus and Millichap, the CEO, came out and said, you'll see an exodus from urban centers for the next 18 months to 24 months, but it's not long-term, right? Long-term, we're going to be okay.
I spent July 4th weekend redoing my bucket list. It was once filled with really lofty things. Maybe not lofty, they're not hard to do in many cases, but there are things I would have looked forward to, taking a cruise in Alaska, or going to New Orleans Jazz Fest, maybe doing an Ironman, dunking a basketball, hitting a 300-yard drive, right? Things like that. First, I got to hit a 200-yard drive. So I was rewriting it, and my loftiness has become a little bit less lofty. I'm looking forward to sitting next to a lady with a dog on her lap on an airplane, right? With the dog making my nose run, right? I miss those little things that, you took for granted, right? Sitting on the Metro North quiet car next to the guy on the phone, right?
Ooh,
that's
buddy.
on my bucket list now. Grabbing some peanuts at the bar from the community cocktail peanut jar holder without fear or shame.
I don't think anyone's ever going to do that again.
Right. So my bucket list has completely changed. And, now it seems like an Ironman is much more attainable than ever eating those peanuts at the bar again.
How about sneezing or coughing in a public place without everyone running away from you immediately?
Yeah, all of the above. Those are good. Well, with that, we'll close. Thanks to our producer, Keegan St. Ange. Join us next week as we look at what's happened during the week and how it may be impacting you. If you have a question or a proposal, send us an email at podcast@trepp.com. Until then, visit trepp.com for more info and subscribe to the podcast with your favorite provider. Thank you for listening, and stay well.
All right.